Barron. I'm head of partnerships for the state of carbon dioxide removal. We are a multi-institutional
years, I have been studying the permanence, safety, and effectiveness of geological CO2 storage, carbon capture and storage, and CDR.
Wonderful. Okay, so to kick things off, I'm going to start by defining CDR by a number of constraints. So first, we borrow the definition from the IPCC, which defines CDR as a human intervention that captures CO2 from the atmosphere and stores it durably in land, geologic storage, or ocean reservoirs. We further constrain the definition of CDR in our reports by three principles. One is that the CO2 must be captured from the atmosphere and not from fossil-based sources. So this is really the distinguishing principle that helps us differentiate CDR from CCS, so we're really going to drill down on that point today. Secondly, the storage of CDR must be durable. Now, the definition of durability is kind of an open question and depends on the context in which you're talking about durability, but in our reports we generally refer to durable as something like on the scale of decades or more. One example of where durable would be, the durability principle would be violated is in panel B. So if you look there, you can see that principle 1 has been satisfied. The CO2 came from the atmosphere. It looks like it's going through direct air capture through the illustration. And then the CO2 is transported to the sustainable aviation fuel and soon combusted and re-emitted back into the atmosphere. So while this might have a climate benefit and help to mitigate emissions from the aviation sector, it would not be considered CDR because it's not durable. And lastly, the final principle is that the removal must be additional to Earth's natural processes. So we have an illustration in panel D kind of illustrating when photosynthesis happens naturally, that is helping to regulate our climate, thank you Earth, but it's not considered CDR because it wasn't facilitated or helped along by human hands. And Catherine, if something spontaneous comes up while I'm talking, you want to jump in, please do. Okay, so I also like to introduce CDR by lumping it into two large buckets. You've got conventional and novel. Probably most of our audience is familiar with these. Conventional refers to afforestation, reforestation, soil organic carbon sequestration, and even ecosystem restoration. To my knowledge, the vast majority of conventional CDR is through afforestation and reforestation, and just broadly the forest management space. And also, the vast majority of CDR that has been delivered today is through conventional CDR. So that's 99.9% of CDR deliveries, and that totals around 2.1 billion tons of CO2 every year. On the other hand, we have novel CDR, which encompasses virtually all other kinds of carbon removal. For those who are here in person, you can see a lot of those examples on the back wall of the pavilion. And novel CDR includes things like direct air capture, includes rock weathering, biochar, and bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, some of which we're going to really drill down on today. In 2023, we estimated that novel CDR delivered about 1.3 million tons of CO2, and then in 2024, we estimated something like 1.5 million tons of CO2 delivered through novel CDR. Okay, so I also like to ground the definition in CDR in the broader context of why we're talking about it, why it matters in the global climate response. So CDR can play at least three roles in helping us, and they break down by whether they're near term, mid-term, or long term. So in the near term, CDR can help us to reduce our net emissions. In the midterm, CDR carbon removal can help us to counterbalance residual emissions and get us to net zero. And in the long term, carbon removal can possibly help us to reach a state of net negative. And this is crucial for helping us get back from overshoot, which is a big topic at COP this year and is looking like it's going to be our reality. So to bring us back to 2 degrees or below 1.5, we'll need carbon removal. I think one of the panelists is going to speak to that later today if you join us for the regenerative something panel at 3:30. Okay. So one of the reasons I think that CDR and CCS are so often conflated is because they're not mutually exclusive. CCS can exist within CDR in some cases, and this is particularly true for the novel methods and particularly for the closed system novel methods. So the ones that came to mind for me were direct air capture and bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. In our reports, this is the first time I had seen this actually, after spending a year in the CDR space, I saw this acronym DACCS, so CCS is literally in the word, and I think they use that to emphasize that carbon capture and storage is part of direct air capture. So the point I want to drive home is that these are not mutually exclusive, and just a little, I guess, interesting fact about the BECCS technology is that it's one of the two largest or highest throughput forms of novel CDR. So to date, BECCS trails just closely behind biochar and being the second largest deliverer of carbon removals. And also interesting to me was that the vast majority of BECCS is disproportionately delivered through the United States in just one state, I think, certainly in the Midwest, in Illinois. Okay. So apologies for this really bizarre AI-generated image, but I could not find a Creative Commons image for direct ocean capture, so this is what we're working with to give you a visual. This is a less commonly known kind of carbon removal, but I came to this space through marine CDR, so I thought I'd touch on it. Direct ocean carbon capture and storage, also known as direct ocean capture, also known as direct ocean removal, is a bucket of different technologies or CDR pathways that basically leverage some kind of energy input, probably renewable energy if it's going to pencil out, and electrolyze seawater. And the electrolysis process separates the seawater into an acid and base stream. The base or alkaline stream is reintroduced into the ocean to potentially help draw down even more CO2 and maybe deliver benefits. That's still being studied to ocean acidification. And then the acid stream is neutralized before being re-released into the ocean. And then crucially, this is the most important part and why it's included in this presentation, is that CO2 can be extracted from direct ocean capture as a purified stream of gas. And then that CO2 can be stored durably in long-term storage, which Catherine is going to talk about, just like direct air capture or BECCS. Okay, so this is where things, I think, in my view, get the most confusing about delineating between CDR and CCS. I wanted to throw in CCUS, carbon capture, utilization, and storage. So I think the fundamental delineation that tells you whether or not it's CDR is if the product that you produce for utilization is net negative. So in this case, it's almost more useful to refer to CDR as a negative emissions technology, or NET, which is pretty much just an alternative terminology for CDR. So how does this work? Something like cement or concrete can be, we can leverage those products and offset their emissions associated with producing cement, which is a high source of emissions globally, because concrete is like the most produced product in the world. And cement requires high heat and therefore a lot of emissions in order to produce it. And so, if you can reduce the amount of emissions associated with its production, then you can help to avoid or mitigate some of the emissions associated with concrete. But when does it become removal? It becomes removal when it's negative, as I said before. And one of the ways in which we can help to really reach a net negative life cycle analysis for mineral-based products is by coupling our alkalinity source, which is one of the inputs for the mineral carbonation process, coupling that with the CO2 that's been extracted from the air through a CDR method, like DACs or BECCS or direct ocean removal. And then you produce basically the building blocks for all of these construction-relevant products like concrete, asphalt, precast concrete, and gypsum base replacements. Okay. And then I did just want to throw in, because this is what I spend most of my time talking about and thinking about, is what are the practical implications beyond just like how the two technologies overlap, but how do the policy frameworks overlap for CCS and CDR, and how about the professional space? You know, we're often interacting with I mean, we're up here on stage together, These all are overlapping networks and overlapping technologies. They both fall under the category of carbon management. I've been engaged with a group called Mission Innovation, who's closely related to Clean Energy Ministerial, and these are multilateral organizations dedicated to accelerating deployment and research and development of clean energy, and recently CDR as well. And so each of those, SEM and MI, both have respective initiatives that are dedicated to CCS and to CDR, and I thought that was a good example of how these are quite overlapping. And those two initiatives, at Mission Innovation and Clean Energy Ministerial, have established joint targets for carbon removal as well. And additionally, an example from the US policy landscape, a lot of folks are familiar with 45Q. This is a well-known tax incentive, production tax credit, that pays, whether it's CCS or CDR, it pays developers to store, I'm not sure developer is the right word, but to store CO2 long-term. For every ton of CO2 that's stored, they get a tax credit. And so it's interesting because a lot of the coalitions who are advocating for that 45Q tax credit may belong as much to oil and gas as they do to CDR, as they do to CCS. And all of those things are slightly different coalitions, but sometimes overlapping, which I found interesting and surprising. And then lastly, we often hear about the importance of separate targets. Separating your emissions reductions targets from your carbon removal targets helps to mitigate against this moral hazard or mitigation deterrence, because it clearly communicates how much is a country or a company going to rely on carbon removal to offset their emissions. I think it's probably equally as important to separate your targets around CCS and CDR for the same reason. Now I'm going to hand it over to Catherine to walk us through CCS and storage.
Thank you, Nico. That was really good framing of what we're talking about today. So I'm going to talk about something that is common to both CDR and CCS, which is storage. And I'm going to talk about the durability of storage because, of course, we're very concerned about reversals as well. So what are we talking about here? So CCS can be both an emissions, so CCS is an emissions reduction technology, all right? When we put CCS on the flue stack of any industry, it can be cement production, iron and steel production, energy production, gas processing, whatever it is, if we put capture on a flue stack and we scrub the CO2 out of that flue stack, we compress it into a liquid, and then we inject it very, very deep into the subsurface for permanent disposal. Okay, that has to be at least 800 meters deep, and many projects are 1,000 to 2,000 to 3,000 meters deep because the CO2 remains as a liquid at that depth. Now, if we were to use bioenergy with CCS and put it on the flue stack, that would be a removal because the plants that are burned for energy took CO2 out of the atmosphere, we burned it for energy, but then we put the emissions away deep in the earth. So that is a removal. You have taken the CO2 out via photosynthesis. Okay. The other way is by using large fans, and Nico showed that on his slides. You can pull it out of the atmosphere. In that case, it is a direct removal as well. The one thing that is common to all is the storage part. So I want to help you understand the storage part because it's very difficult for most people to understand. I do want to talk about permanence briefly because currently, so these technologies are being scaled up. We currently have about a trace amount of CO2 being removed using direct air capture that is being scaled up now as we speak to about 0.71 million tons per year of BECCS. Of course, everything needs to be scaled up. We have the potential to scale it up to 5 to 40 gigatons per year. That's huge, right? So it's really important that we scale it up. And the permanence is durable. Basically, once you get it out of the cycle, out of the carbon cycle, and you put it down, it's there forever. So the permanence is extremely durable. Whereas land-based removals, which Nico also mentioned, currently about 2 gigatons per year, it's working very well for us, but the permanence is less because a tree can burn, you know, and there are reversals that happen because of the environment, because it's still cycling in the environment. Still, we need it all, there's benefits to all. CCS is a mitigation technology that has been approved within this mechanism. In 2001, there was a special report, was invited to the IPCC to write that. It was finally approved in 2005, and then in 2011 at COP17, we had the approved modalities and procedures for the safe storage of CO2 in geological formations for the clean development mechanism. And so we have regulations. They've been in place for a very long time. Ever since the IPCC greenhouse gas guidelines outlined how we can account for greenhouse gas reductions and removals, we can account for them. But these regulations not only care about quantification and accounting, but they also care about environmental protection. So these regulations put in place the workflow, so how we are to ensure that the CO2 storage is durable and permanent and safe. So what do these regulations tell us to do? We monitor these sites a lot. There's a lot of monitoring that goes on. We have to get a permit in order to get a CO2 storage site. We do significant site characterization. We do site characterization, we do risk assessment with modeling to identify any potential risk, and then we design the project to minimize any risk. Then we monitor it in the deep subsurface, in the reservoir, in the layers above, and we monitor the shallow groundwater to ensure its protection, and then we monitor the biosphere. We do this before, during, and after the project. And because of the 100-year permanence requirement, many times these regulations require us to also monitor the geologic storage formation for 100 years. But after 30 years of doing CO2 storage, we've never had a reversal. So it's extremely, extremely permanent. This is how it works. Because a lot of people don't understand how does it go down there and how does it stay down there. So CO2 is injected, it's captured, it's injected into the pore spaces at least 800 meters deep, and it's stored in the pore spaces. So we find a reservoir that is overlain by confining systems so the CO2 cannot rise up. It pushes away the salty water that originally resides in the pores. And it's trapped in between the grains of the rock. There's actually a lot of space in between the grains of the rock. And so it's trapped by many methods. What happens is that the CO2 is trapped in as bubbles between the grains, and it's very sticky. It likes to stay there. It's almost like if you were making a sandwich and you spread mayonnaise on the bread, and then you decided you didn't want mayonnaise and you tried to scrape it off, you couldn't get it all out because it's stuck in the pores of the bread. That's how CO2 storage works. Eventually that CO2 will dissolve into the water and then it will mineralize. So it's extremely durable long term. Full chain accounting is extremely straightforward. Because you're capturing the CO2, compressing it into a liquid, and injecting it down a pipe, we put meters on the pipe. You can measure exactly how much CO2 is going into that subsurface, okay? And the accounting, the IPCC accounting framework is straightforward for the full chain, from the capture to the transport to the storage. Now, emissions factors are used for the capture and the transport, but there are no emissions factors for the storage. And that is why we do so much monitoring, okay? Because we're ensuring that it's not coming back up. And now we have the standard for reversals. And in that standard, you'll see several of the monitoring requirements that I've already talked about. And these are now going to be applied not only to geological storage, but all of the other types of CDR that Nico was talking about. We monitor not only during the project, but afterwards to ensure that the CO2 remains stored. We need to report that monitoring. We need to have plans in place in case there is a reversal. And then the credits, the 6.44 ARs are issued. Depending on the risk of reversal, which there's a tool being developed to be able to calculate the risk of reversal, you may have to put money in, you will have to put money into a buffer pool in case that is reversed. The definition of reversal is the net loss in storage, and the negligible risk of reversal is defined of a loss of no more than a maximum percentage, which is to be specified in the methodologies and calculated over 100 years. So hopefully that has given you a better idea of how the storage works and a better idea of the difference between CDR and CCS. So thank you very much. So do we have any questions from the audience?
Thank you both. I learned a lot. I'm relatively new to the CDR CCS space, but I've tracked Article 6 and carbon market mechanisms for a very long time now. I had a question on the difference between regulations on CCS and CDR. So you talked about regulations, kind of touching a bit on that accounting and environmental protection. Nico mentioned Q45 in the US as well. So I'm just wondering, do these regulations also touch on who has the responsibility to pay for CDR and CCS? I know that some of these mandates are coming through in the UK and the EU, but I'm a bit unsure on kind of the global international context. So if you could explain on that briefly, developments in this space, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I might tell you something you already know, but for 45Q, I think the burden of paying, I guess, is on the taxpayer because it's considered a public good, and so it's taxpayer dollars that are ultimately funding the 45Q tax credit because it's seen as like I said, a public good that they're storing the CO2. It's controversial, though, 45Q tax credit, because to date, the vast majority of 45Q tax credits have been retired for the purpose of enhanced oil recovery, or EOR. And so Democrats like Elizabeth Warren have litigated against this really hard, and in fact there's bipartisan coalitions to abolish the 45Q tax credit because there's people on both sides of the aisle that think it's a waste of taxpayer dollars because it's, from the Democrats' perspective, not having a climate benefit, and maybe from the Republicans' perspective it's not a good use of taxpayer dollars.
I would take another angle on that answer, and just to tell you that right now one of the largest DAC projects is being developed in West Texas by Occidental, with another one coming online in Kingsville in the southeast Texas. And already, as they are building the plant, they are paying to build that plant themselves, Occidental is, but they have already sold most of the CDRs to other companies that they will be generating. So we now have the market, and so that the market mechanisms are driving that direct air capture project. Occidental is paying to develop it, but they are able to sell some of those credits to companies like aviation that want to reduce their carbon intensity through that market mechanism.
That's a great point. I forgot about the markets. Yeah, voluntary carbon markets are also, of course, funding a lot of these credits. Great point.
And also the low carbon fuel standard, the California Air Resources Board low carbon fuel standard also allows direct air capture to be used to lower the carbon intensity of fuels being sold into California. And what's very interesting about that is they allow that direct air capture to be anywhere in the world. Anywhere in the world, which is really amazing. Any other questions?
One more question. We have time for one more.
sense to use CDR or CCS, and in which case this is not a good maybe replacement for the transition away from fossil fuels?
Yeah, I guess I would just say that there is certainly a risk of countries and companies over-relying on carbon dioxide removal to abate their emissions. I would argue that the emissions reductions has to remain the primary response. How that breaks down of percent, I don't yet know, but I think the consensus is just that hard to abate sectors, abating things that we can't more cheaply, offsetting emissions that we can't more cheaply abate through emissions reductions, such as steel, agriculture, aviation. Those are the use cases where CDR makes the most sense. But there's also, an economic analysis that needs to be done about when it becomes more economically efficient to use CDR versus using emissions reductions. In most cases, CDR is going to be a more expensive option than just reducing your emissions in the first place. I hope that helps.
Yeah, and I would just agree totally, and I would just add to that absolutely we need to reduce emissions first. I mean, we need to not put them in the atmosphere to begin with. So really, CCS needs to be deployed as quickly and as widely as we can. But we do know that if we were to stop every emission right now today, there is still too much in the atmosphere. So it should not be, we need to develop that technology now because we're going to be needing it, but we need to reduce emissions. And I would say, again, a Miles Allen of Oxford University quote is, we need to stop fossil fuels emitting carbon long before we stop using fossil fuels. It's the emissions. We got to keep our eye on the prize. We need to stop emitting. This is bottom line, But we will need those removals, but we need to reduce first. Good question.
Okay, so that concludes our session. Thank you so much for your questions. If you'd like to continue the conversation, please come find us after the session. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Nika.
Yeah,
Nice
thank
working
you.
with you.
And stick around because there's another session.